You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. I'm Nassim Ahmed. I'll be your host for this week's conversation. We have a fascinating guest today, Ashira Darwish, one of the producers of an amazing documentary. It's called Where the Olive Trees Weep. It's a really powerful movie offering a really dark and sometimes look at the struggles and resilience of the Palestinians under Israeli occupation. I watched it the other day. It's really captivating. It's won a number of awards on several film festivals. But its impact has gone beyond just movies. I spoke to Cyprus Copeland 2 weeks ago. He's the executive director of Freedom for Palestine. One of the fascinating things about this documentary is that how it's inspired people to plant olive trees in Palestine. So far, I think as many as 1,000 olive trees have been planted. I've been meaning to speak to the producers of the film, and I'm really delighted to have one of the producers, Ashira Darwish. So thank you, Ashira, for joining us.
Thank you, Nassim. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. So Ashira has worked for 15 years as a TV and radio journalist and researcher in Palestine for the BBC, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch. She is the founder of Catharsis Holistic Healing, a trauma therapy project pioneering a type of Sufi active meditation which draws its roots from ancestral indigenous knowledge. The documentary itself centers a lot around you, Ashira, and you are featured quite heavily in the documentary, as is many other prominent global figures, I would say, people like Dr. Gabor Mate, who offers trauma healing work to Palestinians. In the documentary, we see him and several others. But if I can begin with some of the experiences you shared in the documentary itself, particularly the time you spent in Israeli prisons and how that's shaped your understanding of trauma under Israeli occupation. Shall we just begin with that first?
Yes, sure. Thank you. So to clarify, I never actually made it into Israeli prisons, alhamdulillah. I was only detained. I was detained, interrogated, and questioned 3 times, and I never made it to prison because there was nothing against me. I was never charged with anything. I was never accused of anything. I never stood trial for anything. It was just to intimidate, scare, and torture me in order to give away contacts for my work as a journalist. And yeah, the first experience, I was a child. I was around 16 years old. And I went to a protest with my mother. It was a singing protest when the Israelis closed the Orient House in Jerusalem. And I ridiculed the protest because it was a very peaceful protest and they were just singing. But I love to sing, so I was like, okay, this is a great opportunity. And I was attacked by Mustadibin, which is the Israeli undercover unit. And they tried to break my knees before they detained me and took me to the Maskubiya, which is Israeli interrogation and torture chamber. And that was the first time I entered it. And then the subsequent detentions, I also was held and taken to the same detention center. And it was very short detentions, and it's nothing in comparison to the experiences of hundreds and thousands of Palestinians inside prisons. It's nothing in comparison to the torture chambers that Israel is currently operating in State Haman, for example, and also in all the other detention centers and prisons. What Israel has done is transformed these already heavily heavily secured, horrific prisons into direct torture chambers. So whether you're detained, arrested, questioned, you're being tortured just for being inside these detention centers. Even if you've already been sentenced, you are experiencing, our prisoners are experiencing torture right now. And it's just a glimpse, the film gives you a glimpse of the lives of what happens when you do get detained. And this was all prior to the current situation, I have to say and specify, because nothing compares to what is happening right now.
Yeah.
We've seen our prisoners walk out of prison maimed, lost half of their weight. Prisoners are not allowed to eat. Our female prisoners, mothers, sisters, daughters, leaders. Khalida Jarrar is, even though she's medically suffering, she's currently in solitary confinement. Prisoners are not allowed to eat. They're not allowed to communicate with each other. They're not allowed to sleep. It's just horrific, the situation.
And when I watched the documentary, I mean, it is quite long, 1 hour, 40 minutes, I think. And it was produced before the 7th October genocide. You really get a sense of how a nation is capable of carrying out the kind of savagery and crimes we are seeing in Gaza, because the documentary clearly shows the dehumanization and the complete mistreatment of Palestinians, and how that ultimately can lead to a scenario that is unfolding in Gaza. You speak, as I said, you speak a lot about how you were mistreated. How has that then gone on to shape the work that you do? Because you work now with people suffering from trauma, and you offer therapy. So, but on top of that, you're also a journalist, you're also a commentator. How has your experience, because initially you went in thinking peaceful protest is probably the way forward, and then you sat in your movie, definitely you come across way more cynical and pessimistic in some sense. How has your experience gone on to shape the work that you have done and are currently doing?
I think that day my detention changed everything in me. And that's what people don't understand, is the way that Israel arrests and detains children is in a way to affect and change their entire lives and their life path. I was a musician, I was a singer, I was in choir. Everything that I wanted to do was pretty much sing. And you also hear the song in the film.
It's really beautiful, by the way. The songs are, the voice, your songs are amazing. I should add that.
Thank you. It took me 37 years to go back to singing from that incident as a child, because the fear that I felt, the disconnection from my family, the detachment from my family. My sister was beaten on the way to bring me my ID. My mother couldn't help me. It was just this sensation of being completely separated and isolated. And I didn't know that I didn't understand that it was traumatizing until years later when I looked at my life and how I changed. And when I went out of the detention, I was given a detention order that I'm not allowed to enter Jerusalem for a month almost, and I live inside Jerusalem, so it meant that I had to stay in the house. And I felt that it kind of activated me to want to do more. I didn't want to do the music for immediately. It was this feeling that music is something on the side. It's not why I'm there. When there's an occupation, when there's people being tortured, when there's a hellhole like Al-Maskubiyya, music felt like the secondary thing. And I immediately decided that I want to do journalism because I want to expose the Israelis. And I also wanted to be a journalist, unlike the ones who took pictures of me while I was on the floor being beaten. I wanted to be a journalist who's active in trying to support and help the people. And I constantly say this, there's like this big divide of what we're taught about journalism in the Western journalism. Western journalism is, as long as you are balanced and biased towards the West, then that is balanced. If you take the side of the people who are being subjected to torture, genocide, then you are being unbiased, then you're being unbalanced. And this is the journalism that I was taught, that you have to always be on the side of the colonizer, in a way, that you have to ask the victim for millions of questions, and the victim has to prove themselves more vigorously than the person who's perpetrating, even though journalism is supposed to be the power that holds the authorities on check. But the reality of it is all these media outlets, this whole notion that we have a free media is just a facade. And I think Gaza and what happened right now, it opened the eyes of the world that this is a facade. What you see on the CNN, what you see on the BBC, what you see in oh my God, Fox News is alternative reality. It has nothing to do with the reality, except that it's the actual colonizers and the people who support the Israelis and support the genocides and the colonization and the racism to create their own narrative in order for the occupation and colonization to continue. It's a tool for the elite, these big media organizations. It's a tool for control. And it took me a while to understand that. I went into working as a journalist, believing that at least I can change the world through telling the stories. And I kept telling the stories. For years, I was telling the stories of torture of children. For years, I was telling the stories of corruption, also by the Palestinian Authority. For years, we were saying and screaming our lungs out as Palestinians for the world to come and save us from this evil that we are subjected to. And no one was listening, because most of the time, the media outlets would cut you. And as Palestinians, we're always used as fixers. So I spent a lot of time in my life fixing for all these media outlets. And the Western journalists come parachute into Palestine. And we're supposed to go risk our lives as fixers to get them the juicy stories, to get them everything. And then they come and they cut it in a Western mold that is acceptable. So I gave up on that. And I was like, okay, this definitely is not the path. And I thought, okay, let's do human rights, you know. The international community talks about legal rights, human rights. Let's do that. I did Human Rights Watch, I did Amnesty, and they're the biggest, most respected, supposedly, human rights organizations. And still, even there, I would have to sit and prove all the time that we as the victims are the victims, and that Israel's perpetrating an apartheid regime, and that and you have to prove yourself on and on. As it's you know, and you say dehumanization. It's dehumanization on so many different levels. It's not only Israeli.
And it's quite powerful how that's manifested since 7 October on the media. Every time a Palestinian person comes on, they have to jump through so many hurdles, moral checkpoints to prove that they are civilized, you know, and you see that in so many talk shows that for them to have that permission to say, you know, state their case or convey their case, they have to prove they're somehow, you know, normal human beings. Whereas that's not the case with many of the Israelis, and I get that. And years of conditioning has. Without even realizing, many of the journalists fall into that trap where they constantly ask questions to the Palestinian, pro-Palestinian commentator to prove his humanity before they can actually comment. And you've been experiencing that firsthand for many decades now, and that's, I'm sure, wears you down, doesn't it?
It does, but at some point I'm done with it. Like, I don't have to prove anything to anyone, and I think this is like my last call in the film. It's like we don't want to expect anything to come from the uncivilized Western world. If there's anything about civilization, what was decolonizing of my brain process was to discover how uncivilized the savage West is. How uncivilized those people who argue for democracy and who argue for human rights are. They are the most uncivilized because the only people who are allowed human rights are one race. The only people who are allowed rights are two religions and people of two faiths. The Christian Zionists and the Jews. If you are of color, any person, regardless, Palestinian, if you're African, if you're Congolese, if you're Yemeni, if you're Sudani, if you're Somali, you don't have any rights. If you're Spanish and trying to be trying to cross and work and save your life, you're still not human enough for them. And it's This is not civilization. What we have in our countries, what we've always had in our hearts as people of color, as people of native, and people who carry the religion of Islam, and also people who live in our traditions in our countries, we respect everyone. We've never had a problem with the Jews. We've never been the anti-Semites. The people who have a problem with race are the Westerners. It's not us. They paint us as the savages, when the reality of it, the people who are capable of a full genocide and removing the natives from their land are the Americans. The Spanish who went and invaded all of Latin America and created savage, horrific massacres on the people. It's not us. It's not our faith. It's not our belief. It's not our culture. And they come and they teach, and they put the moral caliber for us. They judge us based on this moral caliber, and they try to tell us who's human and who's not human. We respect all humans. We respect the right of everybody to live. The Palestinians, even with everything that's happening in the genocide, you don't see the Palestinians advocating for the death and the killing and the destruction of a full state of Israel. We don't advocate for the killing of children. You don't see Palestinians marching and chanting death to the Jews and burn their children, as you have Israelis loudly sitting on boats watching the children in Gaza being burned and shouting and chanting death to the Arabs and burn them all. And then they come and ask us to show that we are human.
And obviously for Palestinians who directly feel the violence on their bodies from the Zionist project, they're the first and foremost to say that the Zionist project has been brutal and savage. People in the West can comment and say things, but ultimately Palestinians are the one who have suffered from decades and decades of the inevitable trauma and violence that would be inflicted on their natives because of a Western colonial project to displace the indigenous community and supplant them with a European colony. And that has led to a lot of trauma, and trauma is a key focus of the documentary, which you're part of. And one of the comments mentioned by the psychiatrist in the documentary is that Palestinians suffer. Well, first they said there is post-traumatic disorder, which many war veterans suffer and other peoples have suffered trauma. But for Palestinians, that's not the case. They suffer ongoing stress disorder and not post-traumatic stress disorder. So given that trauma is a constant theme, constant feature of Palestinian life, how do you see others like yourself keeping their sanity, being able to live through this trauma? You found your own personal way of doing this, which is to help people and develop this therapy. How are others coping in Palestine in dealing with the ongoing stress that has been inflicted on them?
I wish that we had great tools for dealing with it. We say that we have resilience and we have sumud, that we have inherited from our grandparents and grandmothers who've undergone the beginning of this genocide in 1948. So a lot of us have learned ways to cope because we have been under oppression from this apartheid fascist regime for all these years. But the reality of it, for me, just being in Palestine from the beginning of 7th of October, nothing prepared us for that. And it was even with all the tools that I had, the fear that I had for my children, the fear that I had as a pregnant woman when I was moving between checkpoints, trying to figure out and create scenarios in my mind. If the settlers stop me, how do I pretend that I'm an Israeli? Do I pretend that I'm an Israeli, or do I drive fast? If I drive fast, they're going to think that I'm running and then they'll shoot us. It's constant life under fear, constantly being held hostage by this regime. If you're in Jerusalem, then you're terrified all the time because you're surrounded by the Israelis, you're surrounded by the settlers, you're surrounded by the army. If you are in 48, you're not allowed to speak or utter or show any form of solidarity any form of empathy with your people who are being slaughtered and children being killed in Gaza. You have to shut it all down and depress it. And the problem with all this depression of all of our emotions and having to be all the time in the state of fight, flight, and fawn, people pleasing in 48 so that you can just survive, because they will take you and they will torture you if you open your mouth. And we've seen it to so many poets, writers, singers, musicians. Everybody who's opening their mouth is in prison. 48 Jerusalem mainly because they don't want anyone to speak out. And it's all being depressed in us. And eventually, sadly, it will show up in our bodies. It will show up in the level of disease that we all have and we encounter. And we see it also in Gaza. We see it in the number of people who suffer from cancer, from autoimmune diseases. It's already there. We've been suffering with it. And now it's accumulated and getting heavier and heavier. And the weight is heavy. We don't even know. We say post-trauma. I've always said that we don't have PTSD. We have continuous, ongoing, complex trauma. And the tools that we have in order to support us is collective. In order for this trauma to be healed, we have to have a collective form of healing. The Western modality is an individualized form of healing. They take each person, each soldier that comes out of the war, and they do talk therapy with them in an environment of safety where they can control they can control the environment. Whereas for Palestinians, you can't control our environment. You go into a talk therapy session and then you're out, you can be shot on the street. What kind of therapy is that? You're in a state of trying to get therapy when you are in a state of fear. What works with us is different than what works with the West. It's the same idea of colonization, of also the forms of therapy that are provided to us, that they want to provide us the same medicine that they take, which doesn't work on us because we don't have the same trauma. And they don't want you to deal with a collective trauma. They don't want you to know that the healing that we will get is through the liberation of Palestine. Liberate Palestine and we will have a collective healing. This will be our collective trauma therapy. If Palestine is liberated, then we will be able to be safe. Then we will be able to re-regulate our nervous system. Then we will be able to deal with the situations of what we have and what's been happening to our bodies. All that we can do, all that I do through Catharsis Holistic Healing is help people to build resilience within the body to tolerate more trauma so that they can survive the ongoing trauma that they're going through. We can't take children whose nervous systems is specifically regulated to be safe in an unsafe situation and change them with talk therapy, because you render them helpless. You render them helpless from their reactions, from the way that if a normal body reacts in a situation, it can put you more in danger if you run from soldiers rather than being very still and frozen in facing that soldier. If you don't have the fawn response, which is in a way, the only way that we can cross checkpoints, because we get dehumanized, humiliated. If you have a normal reaction of anger in that situation, you'll get killed.
I think what you just captured is quite powerful. What you're saying is the disease is the collective dehumanization. The disease is the illegal occupation. The disease is the racism and the apartheid. And the cure is to end all that. And Palestinians will not suffer trauma. That would be the cure. And one of the sessions in the documentary is Gabor Mate himself leading a session with a group of females, and one of the Palestinian women said that for I think 20 years she feels she's not cried, she doesn't have the ability to feel, and Gabor Mate's diagnosis was basically the reason why your body is incapable of feeling is your body's way of protecting you from the victim, from the trauma you face on a daily basis. If you had to deal with the emotions of dealing with that trauma every single day, you would basically collapse, emotionally break down. And your body's way of helping you survive is to stop you being able to feel. And I found that quite powerful. So, how did your collaboration with Mate come about, and the movie in general, and that particular session I found quite powerful. How did that all come about?
So I contacted Dr. Gabor and asked if he was ready to come, if he was ready to come and work in Palestine. I explained to him the project. We work with former child prisoners and former women prisoners, and currently we work with everyone because the whole, because the trauma is just far beyond anything that we can fathom. And I asked him if he's ready to come to Palestine, and he immediately said yes, and he was ready, and it was we set up the conference silently, because I didn't want any attention to the work I'm doing. I didn't want anyone to come after us for the work that we're doing, and we work with a sensitive group of people, so we wanted to protect that hub for us. So we never announced that he was coming to Palestine. We announced that we had an online conference with Dr. Gabor, trauma therapy. People signed up for that. And on the day he arrived, the day after, we announced that Gabor Mate is here in Palestine and that we will have the conference in person in Jericho. And it was only, so the group of women that you saw are former political prisoners. The woman that you saw who was asking the question was actually rearrested right after she came out of the conference, and then just released recently in the prisoner exchange. So these are people, women who have suffered continuous, constant trauma, and you can't elevate you can't remove it. As I said, even though she went through a session with Dr. Gabor, that did not save her from the Israeli army coming and rearresting her. And we had a closed container, so the documentary doesn't really, you only see a few images from that trauma conference, because we wanted to have the safety and protection, and the main thing was for these women to be able to have some support and to have some healing. And we also had a doctor from the UK come, Dr. Kath Temple, who works in emotional freedom technique. We also had a dance therapist, Zahira Maus, who came from the Netherlands. And we all worked together for 3 days, intensive. And it was a very powerful experience for all of us who were there. And when I contacted Dr. Gabor, he told me the directors of the film, The Wisdom of Trauma, are also interested in joining him. And I was skeptical in the beginning because I wanted to protect the container. And then they convinced me and told me we're only coming, the topic of Palestine will be a short segment in a bigger documentary that they're working on, which is about intergenerational trauma from colonization around the world. So I was like, okay. And when the events of October 7th happened, they immediately felt the need to speak up about what's going on. And they contacted me and they said, the film is giving birth to an entire film on its own. So that this is what they can do to show what has been happening in Palestine before. And it really takes you to that space where you understand that what's been happening didn't start on the 7th of October.
Yeah, of course, but we should mention the impact of 7 October and the genocide that's taking place in Gaza. So with you working in the field that you do in therapy, catharsis, holistic healing, and trauma therapy, I mean, have you seen any? Of course, the volume has changed, but have you seen change in the kind of trauma Palestinians come to you with, or you see within your own circles and the spaces you are in Palestine? What has there been a shift since 7 October, and also now what's happening in the West Bank, which is also where we're seeing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians? Have you seen a shift in the kind of patients that you see?
In Palestine, the situation is so dire that people are still pretty much operating from a dysregulated nervous system, and they're operating on fight-flight mode because that's their survival mode. They're on survival mode. I've met with the families of people from Gaza who were stuck in the West Bank, and you couldn't do any therapy. You can support them just in the process of being, but the main thing is surviving the genocide, surviving knowing that their parents, their families, their children are being slaughtered and there's nothing that they can do and they're so distant from them. Until this genocide stops, we won't get a chance to see what happened. But what I've seen outside is the effect of this genocide on everybody else. It's been collective trauma, not only for the Palestinians. The Palestinians in diaspora have immediately had somatic reactions in terms of heart problems, immune system, illnesses, physically coming very strong. And for people who have never experienced the occupation directly, it's second generation, third generation Palestinians who are being affected from seeing what's going on, and it's basically intergenerational trauma being activated in their genes from what they are witnessing. I've seen also Muslims around the world who've lived through wars, Iraqis, Afghanistan being activated. And the Jews who are here in the US, for example, that I've seen definitely have been activated because the wound of the Holocaust is opened, gushing. Our bodies don't know race and they don't know religion. They know trauma. So a lot of people got activated because their trauma gets activated from seeing things that are reminiscent of what their ancestors, what they have also witnessed, what they have seen. And people are getting secondary trauma from watching all the images. So all of us, the whole world has been shaken by
Can I just
what
ask you a
Israel has
question
done.
on that? I mean, you mentioned the trauma of the Jewish people and the trauma of the Palestinians. Is there difference in terms of how you, as sufferer of trauma, feel when your trauma is validated? For example, the trauma of the Jews from the Holocaust is constantly validated and acknowledged. What happens if your trauma is not validated or it's not acknowledged, and let alone validated? So is there another level of trauma that you suffer when people dismiss it? People don't acknowledge it in the case of Palestinians.
It's horrific because most of the people who are outside have to pretend as if nothing is happening in order for it to operate in a Western, especially on the Western hemisphere. The Palestinians need to work, eat, pretend that nothing is happening, and they get questioned, and they have to defend themselves at a time that their people are being killed. So the effect is much heavier. And I felt it when I moved out of Palestine, because in Palestine we have each other, we have our communities, we're not isolated. You're dealing with the trauma together, collectively, and you have the support of the community. You have the support and the ability to also, in the West Bank, protest sometimes if the PA doesn't come after you. But in the West, people who are not able, the people who are able to protest, the people who are able to come out and be in community, this is the way that they're surviving. It's a survival mechanism to scream out your anger and not to depress it, and to be in action right now and to be in solidarity with the Palestinians. I also say that for the Jews who survived the Holocaust, being in action right now and screaming against this genocide is how they heal their intergenerational trauma and they heal the Holocaust wound. Can you imagine the Palestinians who are not able to speak, who work in places which they are dismissed, and they're completely isolated and gaslit by their employers, by their friends, by their communities? These people suffer some of the heaviest weight in terms of physically what will happen to them, because they're depressing all of their emotions, because they're having to hold it all in and not be able to even express their anger, rage, fear, despair over what is happening.
We are speaking about trauma and the horrific suffering of Palestinians. The movie is beautifully made, nevertheless, as beautiful as it can be for a program dealing with such emotional subjects. So I urge everyone to go and watch the movie. First, go to the website. We'll put a link on our website itself, Where the Olive Trees Weep. There's been a number of screenings in many different cities around the world. So how has it generally been received? It seems like there's real appetite around the world to hear the Palestinian story. And this documentary is probably one of the best to tell the Palestinian story from the perspective of, the kind of trauma they are suffering from decades of Israeli occupation. So generally, how has it been viewed across the world?
It has been received amazingly around the world. The reactions of the people And it has also succeeded in converting a lot of people. So people who are historically against Palestinians, who are pro-Zionists, watching the film and waking up for the first time, sending us emails that they just didn't know, that the media never told them, that they never saw these things happening. And for the first time, their eyes are open and they become immediately active for Palestine. So we've seen people change, and I've seen people also heal through the film. I was just recently in Sarajevo, and it was a wonderful experience to be in a place where people have felt the trauma. They've been under siege for 4 years. They know that the streets are still riddled by bullets, and they understand what it means to live through war. And they have so much empathy and so much humanity for the Palestinians. So I felt the heavy solidarity, and a lot of them came to me and told me that through this film, it was the only time they were crying. And they know that they weren't crying only because of what they're witnessing for the Palestinians, but they were allowed a space to cry and feel their emotions for what they had experienced during the war. So there's this kind of therapeutic reaction that is triggered in people because they are witnessing and they're able to be in that process and to be in a safe space of grieving while they watch. And the most important thing is it pushes them into action. It validates it for the activists and for the people who stand with Palestine. It validates everything that they have been doing, and it validates for the Palestinians their trauma, and it allows them to know that they're witnessed and seen.
Thank you, Ashira, for sharing your experiences, and also, of course, speaking so frankly about your experience and the horrific detention that you faced under Israeli occupation. I urge all our viewers to go and check out the movie. It's being screened in a number of cities. We will put a link on our website. You can go to the website and check where you can view the documentary. Will it be on YouTube?
They can also watch it online.
Online. So I was going to ask, so it'll be on YouTube?
No, it's on the website. You
on
can
the website.
watch. Yeah,
Okay.
it's via donation. So that's how we were planting the trees. That's how we're also supporting the therapy that we're doing for Palestinians in the West Bank. Even right now, during the genocide, we have people who are on the ground working with Palestinian refugees in Egypt, relocated from Gaza. We're able to work also with children in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Jenin, a refugee camp that's under bombardment, to work with the families of the martyrs. This is all being supported through our audience who watches the films and donates on the website. And it's also, the idea is to get it accessible, so you can put also 0 and just watch the film to receive it. So it's available.
Thank you so much for that explanation and clarification. Thank you again for joining us for this week's conversation with the Middle East Monitor, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Inshallah. Salam.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.